Well, good morning, everyone. This is Steve Newberry. I have an immense pleasure to join you today with coffee and conversation with someone that has had a huge impact on our Commonwealth, on our nation. Been a great friend to me personally over the years. We haven't always agreed politically, but we have certainly had lots of opportunities to talk. And I'm very pleased to be with Senator Mitch McConnell today, who's in Glasgow, to speak to the Newberry Rotary Club. But we had an opportunity a few minutes before to sit down and visit. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Steve, it's good to see you again, and good to be back in Berrien County, and looking forward to meeting everybody at lunch.
Well, we're going to, I'm sure they're looking forward to it even more than you are. Senator, I was reflecting, I bought my first radio station in Berrien County in 1984. And that was a very significant year in your political career. I remember the election of 1984 where the Bloodhounds went to work and you were elected. It's hard for me to believe that's 41 years ago, but you have had an immense impact on our state. Everything from the tobacco settlement, what you've done as the leader, the longest serving, if I'm not mistaken, longest serving majority leader in the history of the Senate. Is that correct?
Longest serving leader in the history of the Senate, yes.
And I know that you have observed a lot. So in the conversation today, I'd like to just get your reflections and your recollections, and we can talk about some of the stuff that's going on today. But I'll begin by saying, I'll ask this question. When you look back on your tenure, what is the thing that you feel most proud of, the thing that you feel was the biggest impact that you were able to have on behalf of not just the Commonwealth, but the nation?
Well, first, Kentucky, I would list two things. One, the tobacco buyout, which I think revolutionized agriculture in our state. And the other is the Brent Spence Bridge. Stuck over tariffs for 20 years. And I signed up with the Biden administration to do a bipartisan infrastructure bill that we're building the Brent Spence Bridge without tolls. And that was a huge problem in Frankfurt because people commuting every day didn't want to pay the tolls. Politicians up there and those of us who ran statewide were afraid of coming out for tolls. And it would have taken such a huge percentage of the state budget that it sat there for 20 years. So I think that was important. The other thing that I would mention is the chemical weapons in Richmond, Madison County had to be destroyed. Took 30 years, finally gone. And so those are I think, kind of the big impact issues I would mention as far as Kentucky's concerned. Nationally, I've been the majority leader and I've been the minority leader. Majority's better. I would list 3 bipartisan agreements with the Obama administration. That Joe Biden and I negotiated a 2-year extension of the Bush tax cuts. We also did the Budget Control Act and the fiscal cliff deal. All these were huge deals that had to be done on a bipartisan basis. And since I was the leader, I was there representing the Republicans. I think it made a difference for the country. And the last thing I would mention, I'm not in control of, is I feel very strongly that we shouldn't pull away from our Ukrainian allies. And I think I may be in the minority in my party on that. But we've got no troops there. The Europeans, contrary to what some people say, are doing more than we are. The Russians are a huge adversary. And if you look at the world today, I think you got the authoritarian regimes all kind of talking to each other. North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, and Iran's proxies, versus the democracies. And we're the leader of the democracies. There's nobody that can replace us. And so I think some people are skeptical about NATO, for example. It's the single most important military alliance in world history. It worked. So I find myself somewhat in a different place from the administration, but I'm trying to convince them.
You're pretty convincing. I've been on the receiving end of some convincing conversations with you, and I should say, I would be remiss if I did not say, as a local broadcaster, you have been incredibly supportive of the local broadcast industry in this country for years. And there were many times that we would be having a conversation and you were in the leadership role and you would give really good advice. So on behalf of radio and television broadcasters all across the country, thank you.
Well, they were just in my office recently, and the big concern now, as you know, is these modern cars may or may not have AM service on them, and that would not be good. So I'm certainly on the same side as those folks.
Well, we're glad for that. Senator, I mentioned earlier, 1984 was when you ran for the first time. You had been the judge executive in Jefferson County before sharing your abilities with the entire state. You have been to the Oval Office, I know, with each president since Ronald Reagan. And I'd like to just kind of get your reflections on, the relationships, good, bad, and different, what you've had. You've worked across party aisles with them. You served in the Senate with the Democrats that have been in office, with the exception of Clinton. But let's just go one at one. You can give me your observation. Ronald Reagan.
I think Reagan didn't know who I was. And I don't blame him. I mean, I was a rookie. And to give you the first kind of embarrassing example, he finally came to Louisville. We've been begging for just an endorsement. And the strategy was, if he won big enough, it would take care of everything else. So one of his first debates was in Louisville, believe it or not, and he did not do well that night. And I remember standing next to Nancy Reagan at this rally that happened afterwards. I tried to make conversation with her. She looked at me like I crawled out from under a rock, and she was clearly in a bad mood. So I just kept my cool. In those days, we didn't have all the technology we have now. We had a film crew there. They were going to film it. I was going to have my moment. Ronald Reagan said, "I'm so happy to be here in Kentucky with my good friend, Mitch McConnell."
Well, I had never heard that story, but hearing it from you makes it even better. First President Bush, what were your recollections about him?
Well, first, let me not skip over Reagan entirely. I think almost everything Reagan did worked. He demonstrated that you can be a right-of-center politician and be popular and effective. And that was in doubt for a number of years after Hoover and the Depression. In terms of personal relationship, I knew both the Bushes pretty well, and had a lot of dealings with the second Bush because I became a leader in his last 2 years. Both of them were great to be around, good sense of humor, smart, willing to make a deal when you needed to make a deal.
What about President Clinton?
Entertaining. I had very few dealings with the Clinton administration. I wasn't in leadership of my party at that point. But I can remember being an intense advocate for NATO expanding once the Soviet Union fell, for NATO expanding as far as we could take it right over to the Russian border. The administration had kind of mixed views about that because we weren't sure whether the Russians were going to become a normal country or still act like. And I think both in the Obama and the Bush 43 terms, they were still, and I can understand it, still trying to have a normal relationship with the Russians. Well, it's a good thing we extended NATO, because they would be running roughshod over Eastern Europe had we not done it. So limited with Clinton. I had more dealings with Obama, but Joe Biden was the McConnell whisperer. And so most of my dealings with them, where I was both the minority leader and the majority leader, were with Biden. We knew each other well. I was the only Republican at his son Bo's funeral. I've talked to him since he lost the election. I mean, we were on a friendly basis. With President Trump, I think most people would say, at the risk of bragging a little bit, that I was right in the middle of the two biggest things that happened during the Trump years. One, obviously, was the refusal to fill the vacancy when Justice Scalia died in the middle of the 2016 election. And then the opportunity to put 3 Supreme Court justices on in a 4-year term. I was right in the middle of all of that. And I think, looking back on my career nationally, the single most consequential thing I was involved in was judges. We also did 53 circuit judges, and our appointments were different from the typical Democrat appointment in the sense that there was a whole movement among right-of-center lawyers that the job of judge is follow the law. And I think, believe it or not, that's not always the way it worked out. And we didn't think the judiciary ought to be another branch of Congress. And I think the men and women that we put on the bench are exactly what I hoped they would be. And the tax reform bill of 2017, many of those provisions are expiring. So even though I'm not in my leadership position, I'm in a pretty significant place still. And I'm sure I'll be involved in extending a number of those tax cuts. But what I decided to do, Steve, in the last 2 years, when I didn't have to be involved in absolutely everything, was to focus on what I thought was the most important. So I became head of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. They control the money for the Defense Department, and to focus on defense and foreign policy and advocating America continuing to play a role around the world. And that has led to my observations about tariffs. I've never been a supporter of tariffs, something Rand Paul and I agree on, which actually makes a headline. And I hope what the president's doing works out, but I'm pretty skeptical. It looks a lot like what happened in the 30s. Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Protectionist Bill. Widely thought that it helped extend the Depression worldwide, and that the only thing that really got us out of it was World War II. And so I hope the president's right, but we've seen this tried before without success. If he succeeds, it'll be very significant.
I want to close by asking you to reflect a little bit on how much the temperament of our country has changed since you've been in service. Gordon Smith, former U.S. Senator from Oregon, who served with you and I worked with his leadership with the broadcasters. I asked him one time, I said, Gordon, has our country ever been this tenuous and this divided? He said, yeah, that Civil War was a pretty big deal. And I kind of laughed at that, and it does give you perspective. But in closing, I would like just your observations, your thoughts, speaking to the residents and voters of Kentucky, Barron County in particular, that are a bit perplexed by the You mentioned that you and Joe Biden were good friends and you could talk to each other despite the fact you had party differences. We seem to be a little more disagreeable than ability to disagree without being disagreeable. What are your thoughts and how would you characterize it?
I would put it this way, looking at the last 40 years when I've been around. I think personally we're still collegial with each other. I do think, though, that there's an anger that's been stoked by the way a number of elected officials have tried to convince everybody the country's in bad shape, and it's because of those people over there, which is not you. And I do think that this level of angry and anxiety is totally different from Reagan. Reagan was a right-of-center politician, hopeful, optimistic, shining city on a hill, managed to convince people who were not normally voting for a Republican to do it. And part of it was the personality. So I do think we're in an angrier period. You see that in a variety of ways. But I don't think the members of the Senate are dysfunctional. I mean, we're not angry with each other. And the Senate's still going to be essential.
Senator, it's a privilege to spend time with you. It always has been. Whether it's been on an airplane that we would see one another or in your office as the leader, you are always so open and welcoming. And I do appreciate that personally. I said earlier we haven't always agreed on policies, but you have always treated me with the utmost help, kindness, and respect, and I hope I've always reciprocated that to you as well. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we do appreciate your being a part of this community, a part of this state, and thank you for your service to our country and to the state. I hope you have a great next 2 years as you finish your term and provide that influence and leadership.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be back here.